Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like Gwen said, this panel is to educate vendors on all the complexities as it relates to the higher education process. Specifically, now that we've got PCI DSS version 4.0 coming out, which, as everyone has seen, it's going to be a lot of work for folks, and then how the universities are preparing for that. So I want you to meet our panelists, so I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Kevin?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Kevin Doar with the University of Washington, and thanks for joining us right before lunch. Appreciate it.
I'm Andrea Hendricks, and I'm at Baylor University, which is a private university located in Waco, Texas. I've been there just over a year. Prior to that, I was at Oklahoma State University. OSU, not the OSU, is a public university, so I have a little bit of a different perspective. Coming from public, now working at private, it's a little bit different scenarios there.
I'm Matthew Moore. I'm with The Ohio State University.
Oh, wow.
We're still above the other OSUs in Google search rankings. So if you search OSU, it's the OSU. But I'm in our treasurer's office. I manage our merchant services, PCI compliance, and several other things as well. I also chair our standing PCI committee.
And I'm Brian Jurewicz. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Arrow Payments. We're a little bit unique of an organization. We help higher eds manage their merchant services and PCI compliance. So I take a hands-on approach to providing that expertise.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to set a little context for this discussion, because I've heard in all the conversations that the university setting or higher education setting is kind of like a small city, and that you are basically the city security manager in that way. Would everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, so my first question to everyone is, from a program management inventory perspective, how do you manage the merchants? How many merchants do you have? How many transactions are you doing? Can we get a little idea about that?
Yeah, so at Baylor University, we have around 50 merchant IDs, which I think probably puts us in the smaller scale, but at OSU, we had 150, so I've seen both sides of the coin there. We're doing around 151,000 transactions, but that doesn't include some major areas, so all of our dining and all of our bookstore is outsourced. We do have athletics and advancement, which is a little different than some schools. It's kind of a mixed bag there. We manage all of our merchants by having a giant spreadsheet, which sounds terrible and old school, but I think that's probably where a large majority of universities handle it that way. Lots of tabs to keep track of who's doing what, because as Elizabeth said, it is like a small city, so we have dining, bookstore, parking, all of these things, and it's a lot to keep up with. Some of the universities do a little different. Kevin has a little more sophisticated approach.
That's one word for it. We manage it very carefully. Look, we have 350 merchants. We do approximately 6 million credit card transactions a year. So we're level 2. We're pushing up against that level 1 status. 3 hospitals. I believe we're up to 20 neighborhood clinics. We have advancement, athletics, all the housing, food services groups. It's almost not even a small city. It's a big city at this point with the University of Washington. We manage our merchants in a program through a division called Merchant Services, which is what I lead. It started up about 6 years ago. And we handle our inventory. We actually use Salesforce. We were fortunate enough. We were using SharePoint, and we happened to hire someone who knew Salesforce really well and started using that. And that's worked extremely well for us, because you have to know your inventory. If you don't, you'll never be compliant. So, and Matthew, you have even more merchants than I do.
We do. We don't have quite as many transactions. We've got 675 active merchant accounts. We only do about 3 million transactions a year. We have completely contracted out our parking operations and our athletics concessions, so that keeps the numbers down a little bit. But with that many merchants, it's very difficult to keep track, and that covers everything. The 675 covers everything from our airport, our golf course. We're a land-grant university, so we have 88 county extension offices. We have an office in every county in the state. We have 4 satellite campuses, as well as healthcare and dining and all the things that the universities usually have. We did have spreadsheets. We've moved ours to an access database, which is a little bit better, I guess. It at least lets us keep track of merchants and their associated terminals and equipment and things. So it's gotten a little bit better, but it's still not the best.
And for our clients, we really have the gamut. So we have some schools that are small community colleges. They may even be, level 4 merchants all the way up to level 1 merchants. And every one of those schools is unique. As Elizabeth mentioned, they're like little cities. So if you imagine the difference between athletics, their ticketing systems, dining halls and their POS systems, tuition systems, foundations and their donation systems, dining halls also sometimes have their internal cards that they use across campus for students. So you have to figure out those in relation to everything else that's happening, parking, you name it. So we've seen just about every way of managing this. We typically start by surveying most of the departments to understand how they're doing things today. And then if they want to use spreadsheets, we'll use spreadsheets. If they want to use Salesforce, we'll use Salesforce. So we really try to help them understand how they're managing things today and really gathering all of that information and then putting in the best place possible. Obviously, some of our clients also use their PCI portals to keep track.
Yep. Okay, so how do you actually scope PCI standards, whether that's DSS or point-to-point encryption, at a university?
Very carefully. It depends. So Baylor has kept things very centralized and limited in scope. Prior to me coming on board, there was a very small subset. They had even less merchants. They didn't allow departments to fulfill orders. We sold parking and ticketing, but we didn't ship T-shirts, or if you wanted to sell a T-shirt, you actually used a third party. We didn't do any of that. So regular departments were not taking a lot of credit card transactions. We had a dedicated PCI network using thin clients, and we had analog terminals like a lot of schools around the country. And then we have converted those to validated P2PE. So if you want to take payments, you have to use validated P2PE or fully outsourced e-commerce. We're trying to move away from any redirects just for getting ready for 4.0 and some scanning issues. And we're just trying to limit everything we can and reduce our scope. I think you're going to hear from all four of us, that reducing scope is the only way that you can even attempt to get in the right spot across a university that has so many merchant IDs. I know I'm preaching to the choir here with my 50 little merchants, but Matthew and Kevin, they can tell you how there's no way if you don't reduce your scope that you can get there.
Yeah, picture a network, a computer network that's designed for sharing. That's what a university is, right? You share, you collaborate with different universities, with different departments. Now picture sending credit card data over that network and trying to be PCI compliant. It does not work. So that's where P2PE validation is so important. I think there's very few universities I know that don't use P2PE terminals at this point. And then we also have a centrally managed e-commerce platform that we manage in-house that makes us merchant type A. So it's really all about getting to A and P2PE to get that scope down. Because if you're trying especially a public university, but any university, trying to answer 300 plus requirements for PCI 4.0, you're not going to pass. But if you can get that scope down to 30, 40 requirements, now it becomes something that you can do.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, I sit in our treasurer's office, which is helpful. Most people think of PCI as primarily IT-related requirements. And so I have a lot of people to help me with that. But being on the finance side of things actually helps with scoping because it helps us identify what's out there. Part of the challenge at a big university is making sure somebody hasn't gone rogue and signed up for their own PayPal account to start taking credit cards, and you don't even know about it. So by being on that finance end and being aware of the money that's coming in and helping with the deposits and things, it really does help make sure that you know what all is going on. Beyond that, we work within our PCI committee to establish a solid PCI policy and requirements documents to really help drive what's acceptable at the university for accepting payments. And again, just like Andrea and Kevin have said, P2PE, outsourced e-commerce, that's really the only way to go, because it's very difficult to manage network requirements otherwise. And it's difficult to provide support to all of the different units if you're trying to support 28 different solutions and all kinds of different hardware and software that's out there. The more we can focus on keeping our integrations with our approved partners and keeping with standard software or standard terminals, through our main acquirer, that really helps out. Our PCI committee is made up of IT representatives from each of the major areas that manage their own networks at the university. So those people are a little bit more in tune with the operations in their specific areas. So we have areas like our student life, our athletics, our advancement, and they're ultimately responsible for the operations in their own areas, but having that committee to serve as sort of a sounding board and a repository for knowledge and questions is very helpful in determining whether something's allowable, or, hey, I'm looking at doing this. Have you guys ever used this system? Or how are you handling things through your call centers? So it's very helpful.
And as I mentioned, we typically start with surveys for our clients to really understand what's happening internally. As Matthew mentioned, it's virtually impossible to keep your hands around all these departments. Athletics likes to do their thing. They have power on campus. Development, is raising money for the school. It's hard to say no to them. Yeah. So for us, it's how do you reach out consistently, typically on an annual basis, to really ask the questions. Are you typing any credit card data into computers? What systems are you using? Send us your terminal serial numbers, and making sure that they're really following policy and procedure and working with those schools to simplify those policies and procedures. SAQ-A and P2PE environments are critical. If you start getting outside of that scope and you're dealing with virtual terminals or SAQ-C or D environments, you're bringing in pen testing, segmentation. It's just way too complex across an organization that has as many connections as a university does. So we're really constantly evaluating, reviewing, meeting with those departments to understand what they're doing, where they want to go. So taking a collaborative approach, not just a hand-slapping approach, but say, hey, where do you want to go with your payments? Do you want more online? Are you looking for more mobile? And then really trying to understand some of those details. We're in the process right now actually of doing a survey with University of Washington where we're trying to evaluate voice over IP to figure out how many people are taking phone payments and where does that ultimately come into scope. So it's kind of a never-ending battle.
So it's sounding more like a tiny nation than a small city for a lot of this. So that brings me to the next question. How exactly do you handle the vendor management if you've got all these multiple possible solutions running around that you may not know about?
Yeah, vendor management is tough with the university, and I think it's tough. I'm hoping there are a lot of vendors out here today, because it's tough for vendors to sometimes grasp with higher education how difficult it can be for us to sign a new contract. We're dealing with state laws, we're dealing with national laws, we're dealing with all sorts of different regulations, whether it's FERPA, whether it's PCI. There's a vast different things that we have to do to sign a contract when we go RFP for a bid. As far as what we do within PCI compliance, we have a PCI rider we require all our vendors to sign to ensure that they are compliant, they will stay compliant, and they'll be using certified P2PE terminals. And we also assess the vendor. If I'm using a centralized e-commerce platform and another one of our university merchants wants to do something different, which happens all the time, we want to try our own thing, we're going to assess that vendor to determine, do you really need that other vendor, or the vendors that we already have in-house signed, can they do the job? So it's within the University of Washington, we really get a hard line on that, because there's so much involved to signing with a new vendor. And every time you sign with a vendor, guess what? Your scope expands, and you're dealing with even more potential PCI compliance. So it takes a lot to, I don't know how it is with you all, but it takes a lot to get a contract signed at a public university.
Yeah, so I've been on both sides of the coin there. So at a public university, Kevin's right, there's a lot of red tape, which I think a lot of vendors maybe just don't understand. And so we have preferred vendors. At Baylor, we do have the same procurement process. but we're also not dealing with as many state regulations as you are at a public university. We have a little bit more freedom to kind of look at vendors and assess what we need and what we want to use. But we really have a few preferred vendors that we work with. We talk about higher ed being a small nation or city, but the other thing is like higher ed is a really interesting niche where in the real world, people are not open to maybe sharing ideas and vendors they use and who are you using, who does a great job. And in higher ed, that's something that we have a higher ed panel or a listserv. And people are all the time saying, oh, we use this vendor, they're great, they understand higher ed. And so it's something that, or we have to educate them on, we're a city. And so we're hoping that maybe this will help clear up some things, but we have preferred vendors we use. We steer people towards that. If they want to use something other than our preferred vendor, we also have a payment card oversight committee, just similar to Matthew, where you have to bring your solution to us. We will look at it. It's made up of members of large processing areas on campus, athletics, advancement, finance area. And we're actually going to evaluate that request for business need and compliance and risk issues. And then that committee is going to give an approval or denial. Since I've been there in the last year, we haven't approved any new vendors, but maybe it will happen. I don't know. I can't say. In the past, I know we do have some that are not our preferred vendors, but it is something different, I think, in the private institution where we really are looking at that business need and cost and evaluating that. And they're not scared to deny you, where previously they didn't want to say no. They didn't want to make anybody mad. So we're really looking at what vendor can help us get where we need to be. How do they understand higher ed? Is it something that we already provide, or are we bringing on something else that's going to make our scope even larger? And doing that review to do our due diligence to get where we need to be. So.
Very similar to Andrea, we have an IT security focused risk assessment process that we go through for any new payment application, any kind of application that wants to be used on campus. And I feel like I'm really lucky, actually, that we've had really good buy-in from our OCIO's office to really incorporate PCI requirements into our broader information security, information security policies and practices. So anytime there's a new application that's going to be used on campus, it's reviewed by our assessment working group. We use a risk assessment. It's based on the HECVAT, the higher education vendor assessment tool. And if anything in there even has the faintest smell of payments, then the PCI committee gets involved in that assessment to make sure that we're reviewing data flow diagrams and we're reviewing, to make sure that there's an attestation of compliance, and we're making sure that our PCI addendum gets signed in the contract, like Kevin had mentioned earlier. So it's very nice to have that support from higher up in our organization to be that involved and that baked into the process. Additionally, we rely on our PCI committee. Like I said, once the vendors are on board, kind of manage the vendors in their areas. They're responsible for collecting AOCs annually, but it's very nice to have that overall acceptance at the university and understanding that PCI is important and needs to be considered before we just go sign it up for software willy-nilly.
Do you all have, so one thing that a lot of universities have is we have a state contract and a required payment processor we have to use. Do you all?
We don't actually. So we piggyback on our state contract for Amex, but we have our own separate contract for our primary acquiring.
Okay.
And was that contract an RFP?
It was, as a matter of fact, an RFP. So that's the other exciting thing is dealing with us. We have to go out for RFP, and we have to do it every so often. We've been lucky that our purchasing department has been getting a little bit more generous with how they're interpreting our requirements. So we, as a public university in Ohio, we are actually an instrumentality of the state of Ohio. We are government when it's inconvenient, and we're not government when it's inconvenient. It seems like we get the worst of both worlds and not the best. But part of that means that we are stuck with a lot of the state procurement rules, but we generally can't sign any contracts for longer than about 5 years. And every time we have to go back out, if it's over $50,000, we have to go through the full RFP process again. And nobody really likes that, but it's what we're stuck with.
And I would say, communication and collaboration are critical, both internally within an organization, the size of a university, as well as externally and collaboratively amongst different schools. We see, certain vendors may perform well at one school, and school B may have never worked with that vendor, but because we've seen them somewhere else, we know it works. We know what processors they're integrated with, or which EMV devices they're certified to. It helps, because if you're stuck in a RFP type contract for your processing, or a state agreement, and you have exclusivity, and that's the only processor you can use, you're now limited as an organization to which software you can use. Are they integrated with that processor? Can they provide point-to-point encryption devices that work with that processor? We have another state school that's not on the stage here who is bound by a state contract, and the processor on the back end doesn't really integrate with any point-to-point encryption devices. And so we're now trying to get the state contract to have an amendment with a P2PE device provider, when if we could just go back out to the market and say, hey, who has the best solutions available, we could bring those to our client and really help improve and streamline their payments. And then reconciliation is another side of that. So every one of the departments has to ensure that the money's flowing back to the school's bank, and it needs to be tracked, and it needs to be integrated in most cases with their accounting system. So if you bring in a new solution or new merchant provider that doesn't have the ability to either track the funds through their merchant account back to the reconciliation, you now have more processors that you have to manage, more reconciliation points to deal with, obviously more devices. So it really becomes complex across all of those details. So we always start with, who's the processor going to be? Is it a third-party owned merchant account, or is it going to be the university that owns these MIDs? Can they use the university's agreements? If not, can we make an exception? What are the rules? What are the policies of the university in order to make those exceptions, and really kind of work through the details? And then, of course, make sure that we're gathering AOCs from every vendor on campus that touches payments, and making sure that they're PCI compliant.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the takeaways that I'm hearing, at least from a vendor perspective for higher education, is come talk to these folks and learn, like if you want to break into that space, learn what is necessary to get in, whether it's a public university or private university, come do that. And also, I think I heard, if you're on the higher ed space, don't mention payments. Okay. Yeah. All right, so this is going to be about PCI DSS version 4.0, because everybody's very interested in this. Like, how are you all preparing? And, if you've already started, what have you come up against? What are your, the best practices and the gotchas that everybody should be aware of?
So, again, I think this is where we're lucky to have a very supportive central IT department. Between our digital security and trust team that can handle a lot of scanning for us, and our previous efforts to move to P2PE and outsourced e-commerce, we are hopeful that the new requirements in 4.0 are not going to be a huge impact for us. We have transitioned almost entirely away from redirects that we own. So we don't have many locations that are going to be impacted by the new ASV scanning requirements. Again, internally, we're conducting a lot of change control scans and script scanning and things like that for other reasons already. So to be able to piggyback off of that with our internal team to meet the PCI requirements is very helpful. So we are looking forward eagerly to being 4.0 compliant at our next attestation.
Sure, Matthew. Sure. You don't have to lie to all. I think, we've been preparing for 4.0 for a while, not just in knowing that that's coming, but by all of the things that we've been doing over the years, reducing our scope, trying to fully outsource all of our redirects. Previously, I was telling someone last night, I'm like, I don't know. There's a lot of universities out there that your redirect is coming from a website. You have no idea what that is. So how in the world are you going to be able to scan it when you don't even know where it is? And so for us, we're trying to move away from all the redirects. Everything's fully outsourced. My CIO has been heavily involved in PCI for many years. In fact, that's how I first met him when I was working at OSU and he was working at Baylor. He was the PCI guy. And so we're having meetings, discussions to keep on track of what we need to get done. We have some procedures and policies that we need to get updated, but we want to believe we're on a good track. Brian?
I would say, I hate to keep saying surveys, but we are also now surveying all of our clients' merchants to figure out where do your customers begin. So is it on a university website, and is it a link from the university website to a payment page, or is it to a shopping cart? And is that shopping cart where you basically select what you're going to ultimately pay for, and then when do you have to go back to vulnerability scanning? Because most schools are P2P and SAQA. It's the vulnerability scanning that is creating the biggest sort of buzz. Do they even have vulnerability scanning if they didn't need it before? Does their vulnerability scanning contract have enough in it in order to be able to handle all the new vulnerability scanning, or do they have to go back out to market to get a new vendor? And then again, where do you begin? There's been some mixed concerns over, if you start and go from the university website to a hosted payment page, that should be scanned at the university website. But if those websites have never been scanned before, are they going to pass? And when should we start scanning? What are we going to do about any vulnerabilities that are found? And then we've even had schools ask us, well, what if I host my payment link on Facebook? Do I have to now scan Facebook? Again, where do you begin? Where do you end? And how do you help those schools ultimately move forward and figure out those details?
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember when AEP first came out. Yeah. And universities were clobbered by that. And I think one of the great things about 4.0 is the council has done a fantastic job prepping and training people. I see Mark in the front row. It's just been great about training, blasting out, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. So we've started the quarterly scanning process. We're working with our merchants who aren't passing those scans to make sure we take care of them. My biggest concern is a 4-letter word, and as soon as I say it, you're going to see these two their faces are going to flinch, and that's VoIP. VoIP at universities is an extremely difficult issue that we're all working through right now. And my biggest concern is making sure we're prepped for that and taking our phone networks out of scope. Because if you're using VoIP, it's a computer network. As soon as you're taking payments over it, guess what? That whole network's in scope for PCI compliance. So that's our biggest project we're working through. I'm pretty confident about handling the scanning requirements, as Matthew mentioned. But for us, it's de-scoping that phone network as much as possible. That's the thing we're working on the most right now.
Okay. Thank you for that. Point-to-point encryption seems to be a really good solution for the higher education environment. So we'll get everybody in touch with our point-to-point encryption experts. Okay, this last question for everyone. What is the one thing about this topic that you would like to leave the audience with?
I think for me, I would just stress how different we are than the normal customers. If you're a vendor, how different we are as an operating platform, as an operating business, as a university. It's so different. And I have a background in retail management and business before I came on board with public work. And it is just so different in terms of the intricacies, in terms of the contract requirements, in terms of the questions you get asked, in terms of your scoping, in terms of how you think of your customers. We're not thinking customers, we're thinking higher mission, taking care of our students and our patients. So it's a very different environment. It's a great environment to be a part of, but just know that if you're coming into it and you've never done it before, you need to keep those things in mind. And then the second thing I'll say is that along with having a blast that we do where we ask to help each other through email, we meet monthly. So we have a monthly call where it's just universities, and there's also something called the Payments Academy where universities and vendors go to present and talk through all these different issues. So it's just a very different environment, but we're also very close. And what happens to one of us, the rest of us hear about it. So, but it's a great environment to be in. Matthew?
Yeah, no, I'm going to come back to a couple of the procurement issues that we talked about earlier. So, we do have these contracts. We have preferred vendors. We're trying to limit our scope. So there are a number, on the e-commerce side, there's a number of companies out there that are focused on higher education, right? I think they primarily all started with accepting tuition payments, and they've grown out from there. And they offer integrations. And using a solution that integrates with one of these partners that's already focused on higher education is wonderful for us. It makes our job so much easier because we know that integration, we can work with it, we know how the security works, it keeps things a lot simpler for us. These companies are, I think, generally very eager to bring new integrations and new partnerships on board because that helps them sell themselves out to universities. And just about every university works with one or more of these companies. So there are several of them out there that are in the higher ed space that have a lot of integrations, and that is a wonderful way to get into the higher education market. Because like Kevin said, selling stuff is not really our business, right? It is an afterthought. It's something that we have to do. It's something that a lot of areas in our operations get really excited about. And also, we've got a lot of overhead and a lot of policies and things that are not focused on that. So anything that you can do to kind of break through that and get in using a vendor that we already have on board is very helpful. Additionally, there's seems to be a big shift right now towards using integrated processing, right? Selling merchant processing as part of the payment experience and forcing us to use an integrated processor or to sign a connected account agreement or something like that can just be a non-starter for us. If we already have our acquiring agreement that says it's an exclusive agreement, and you say, well, no, now you have to use XYZ merchant services to use our application, we may say, sorry, that's it. Thanks for coming. We can't do business with you. Additionally, again, the more processors that we have to work with, the harder it makes our job, and we really don't want to do that. So anything that can integrate, again, with what we already have and not require us to deal with state laws and federal laws and contract red lines and all of that, just to get to the starting line, makes our lives a lot easier and makes it much more likely that we can do business for you and find the solutions that our areas are looking for.
Matthew, you have 650 merchants. How big's your team?
It is 1 and about to be 1.5.
Yeah, and that's typical for a university, right there.
Yeah, complexity is never ending, right? I mean, you're stuck in some situations with contracts, but technology continues to evolve and change. So, in some of the schools we work with, they signed their merchant services agreements before PCI compliance even really existed. Definitely before mobile payments, before EMV, before point-to-point encryption. So trying to help them evolve is, I think, the biggest key. And how do you help them have the wherewithal, the experience to be able to move quickly and adapt and be flexible and adjust? Because some of these departments, they want new contracts, they want to try new technologies, and it's really hard to stop them from doing that because you want money to come in. At the same time, the decision makers at universities don't want to stick their necks out. The people who make the decisions don't want to have to go through another RFP. They don't want to have to be the ones to say yes. let's make a change here and let's do something different, because they're not necessarily going to get a promotion or they're going to get a raise, or if the school makes more money, they're going to be sitting in a better position. They're focused on education. And so helping them become, better at their roles and achieve their mission is really the key. And then helping them have that experience and expertise to make those decisions, and the right decisions, is critical.
Yeah, Brian's absolutely right. Right, as universities, we're not in the payments business. Our campus merchants, they don't want to take payments. They want to not worry about it. They want to make life as simple as possible. Payments is a necessary evil for them. So from our standpoint, our role is really to help make it as easy as possible for them. In the higher ed business, we're looking for vendors that want to work with us hand in hand, that want to understand what we do, and be able to do the things that we need to do in the most efficient and secure way possible. We may be, we're only 50 merchants. Maybe we only do 151,000 transactions a year. But we have Matthew, we have Kevin, we have 200 other universities, and how many transactions are they doing? There is a large opportunity there for a large volume of transactions. When we talk to vendors, that's a lot of times on our calls or at the conference, someone says, oh, I'm trying to work with so-and-so. Let's all get together. And then, people will want to work with us maybe and say, oh, this is worth our time or effort. Or there's a handful of vendors, as we've talked about, that are higher ed focused. They understand it, they get it, and they're awesome to work with. They understand the processes, whether it's complex and long and drawn out, but they're great to work with. And so we're hoping that, I think our mission today is just kind of explain more of why it's so weird. We know it's complex. It's in the title of our panel here today. So we're just trying to explain why it is. So
yeah,
awesome.
If you take all the universities, just in the United States, but let's take all of them in the world and add up all their transactions and all their volume, we are arguably the biggest company in the world with all the transactions of volume we do. And we're all dealing with the same similar issues.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all very much for that. So if you're interested in having further conversations with any of the panelists, you can contact them on the event app or find them in the vendor showcase. But we welcome any and all questions once we're off the stage, of course. And, just my takeaway from this is, have the conversations. I love the fact that you all have the group that, we've been more involved in that too from the PCI side, because we want people to, it's in my title, community engagement. We want you to find your community, engage with your community, learn from your community, because you're all in this together. So thank you all very much for joining us. And I guess we'll turn it back over to Wen.